morning, everyone. Matt Swartz here. Captain Dieguez, I want to thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to speak today. I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to have this discussion, and hopefully it is a robust discussion, bringing a fleet perspective to the discussions that you guys will have the rest of your industry day and the rest of the event that you have planned down there in Jacksonville. I also like to echo the thanks to Mr. Howard, and also highlight the support for Ms. Susan Sharp here from NAVFAC headquarters, whose skills and expertise ensured that I could come to you virtually today. I will share that I wish I was with you today and had planned to be there with you today during this event, but unfortunately, as most are following real world events and also a call from DC, limited my ability to get down there to Jacksonville. But I will share with you that if I can't do it there, the best place to have this discussion is from NAVFAC headquarters as opposed to somewhere in the halls of the Pentagon. So I want to thank NAVFAC headquarters, Ms. Latore, for their hospitality to allow me to leverage this facility to come to you today. So thanks for that. And if I could, Ryan, if I could just get it up check that you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you. And also, would like to highlight Captain Dieguez, just perfect timing in terms of holding today's event based on where things are in the world, and also to highlight the comments you shared earlier about the SNA conference that's happening in parallel today. The CNO provided her vision during that event, which you highlighted, and I'll roll into my comments as well. Amilcana also had the opportunity to have a discussion with that audience regarding force generation and impacts of fleet readiness associated with the total Navy enterprise and our ability and the demands on us to generate forces to be able to respond worldwide and globally. And I'll highlight that as well. But more importantly, from a timing perspective, I think it's perfect timing to have a discussion regarding our ability to accelerate performance. When today, this morning, and in the last couple of weeks, we have sailors who are operating in harm's way, who are engaged in kinetic warfare, representing the United States and also defending our freedoms. And if there's anything that we could do on their behalf, it's to have a discussion about how do we accelerate performance and make sure that we're delivering the things that they need so they can execute their mission. But more importantly, that as things back home for their families and family readiness, that we're providing the things necessary for them to not have to worry about what's happening back home, and they can stay focused on the mission. So a discussion around accelerating performance, I think, is timely. The one item I'd like to highlight also that the CNO referenced yesterday at the SNA event was she indicated that we're in our 1930s moment. And why is that important? As she highlighted in 1930s, where we were as a nation, we were just coming out of the Depression. We had constrained defense budgets. We had significant issues in our ability around construction, our industrial capacity. The gap between capability and capacity was significant, meaning our real-time readiness was at risk in terms of our ability to deploy, and ultimately our ability to engage in conflict and in war was definitely at risk coming out of the Great Depression. And so that's where we are and where we were in the 1930s. And I'll weave that into my conversation in terms of where we are today and what's that mean for us from a fleet and also from a NAVFAC enterprise and where you see yourselves within that. I'd also like to highlight a quote that I use periodically in these types of engagements that I'll highlight as we go through and ultimately highlight the importance of where NAVFAC fits in that. And it's a quote that was provided by General Mattis. I had the opportunity to attend ICAF and the Industrial College of Armed Forces, one of the war colleges. And during one of our events, General Mattis, when he was the commandant, posed a question to the audience. It actually was a question that was posed to him, and then he provided the answer. But the question that was posed to him was, why is the United States Marine Corps the most lethal fighting force the world has ever known? And the answer that he provided to that question was because once a Marine, always a Marine. And of course, that answer provided a little bit of humor to the discussion, but he elaborated on that answer as he worked through his comments there. And I'll share a little bit of his answers and the theory around that, why I think it's really important and ties to ultimately the CNO's vision in terms of warriors, warfighting, and foundation. But at the end of the day, as she highlighted in the 1930s event and also provided her vision for the future, I think the question that we have is, where does NAVFAC fit in a discussion regarding warriors, warfighting, and foundation? And I hope to bring you a little bit of a fleet perspective of where we believe this enterprise fits inside of that, and perhaps maybe a different perspective in terms of the magnitude of your portfolio and what it means for fleet generation and force generation. But if we can go to the next slide, and ultimately you can build this slide and add the now and also the bumper sticker, so 2 builds, and hopefully you're following. I can't see the slides here. But I wanted to paint a little bit of picture building on where the CNO said we were in 1930, and ultimately looking at where the nation was in 1945 and where we are today. And I think some of these statistics and metrics are interesting. I think they force us to think about where we are as a nation and ultimately where we need to be. But if you look at where we were in 1945, from a manufacturing rank perspective of all the global economies in the world, the United States was number 1. And in fact, we were number 1 by a significant margin. Then you look at Germany as number 2, the Soviet Union is number 3, and the United Kingdom is number 4. But ultimately, the Allies during that period represented a large portion of the capability globally in terms of industrial capacity and where we were from a manufacturing perspective. If you look at where we are in 2023, the United States is no longer number 1. China has surpassed us in terms of manufacturing rank. I think that's all known to everyone. And then if you look at number 2s, 3s, and 4, you see our allies and partners there. But in reality, China as a whole has more manufacturing capacity than us and our allies in the top 4 combined. So we are no longer leading from a manufacturing perspective. And I think that's significant as we walk through the portfolio here today. And then if you look at the metrics below that, from a population perspective and where we were with manufacturing jobs, the US population was about 140 million, and we had almost 16 million manufacturing jobs in our nation at that time. That's 11% of the total population was manufacturing jobs. Where we are today, about 330 million in terms of population and 12.9 million manufacturing jobs. That's 3% of our total population in terms of manufacturing capacity, a significant reduction in terms of total population, but also in terms of total manufacturing expertise. Where we were in 1945 exceeds where we are today. If you look at tech jobs, which is fascinating, and I'll roll that into the evolution, I think, of this portfolio, but ultimately in the tech sector, there's less than 700,000 jobs in the United States in 1945 in the tech sector. Most of the tech sector jobs at that time were around electronics and ultimately small electronics tied to traditionally industrial capabilities and tool sets. Where we are today, we have as many tech sector jobs as we do manufacturing jobs. And that's just a sign of where we are and as things modernize. But ultimately, you see in terms of expertise and skill sets, an evolution towards our expertise evolving to the technology sectors and ultimately the manufacturing expertise getting smaller over time. From an ordnance production capability perspective, where we were in 1945, 92 ordnance production plants in the nation in 1945. And that shouldn't be a surprise. We're coming out of World War I and World War II. But in terms of the manufacturing capacity and skill sets and our ability to produce things to be able to support the defense enterprise was significant. In terms of the manufacturing and industrial capacity in this nation and where our expertise were as a population, you see that relationship. Today, from an ordnance production capacity perspective, about 600 plants worldwide or in the United States. The next set of metrics all indicate where we are from an inflationary perspective. If you look at the price of oil, $1 compared to where we are today, almost $80 per barrel. So the inflationary impacts and the cost of goods from 1945 to where we are has also increased. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But I'll roll that into comments later in terms of economic impacts associated with this portfolio. From a utilities perspective, basic utilities that we used in 1945, we use today, I think is the ultimate theme between those two comparisons. But the reality is the modernization in terms of how we deliver utilities today versus then is significant. Right now, of course, you still have electricity, gas, water, all those types of things. But ultimately, internet and communication services now become a basic utility. And ultimately, the introduction of the Internet of Things. We have IP-enabled everything in this country. Ultimately, even the capabilities and the utilities that are provisioned by NAVFAC, We now have smart grid technologies where we've IP enabled the electrical infrastructure. And ultimately, there's goodness associated with that. But what's that mean in terms of the ability to execute this portfolio? Is that the skill sets and the talents that you look for have evolved over time. You're not only now recruiting industrial, manufacturing, facility, civil engineering expertise, but you're also looking to identify folks within your portfolio that have those technology skill sets to bring those skills into this portfolio, making your ability to identify talent, hire talent, and also provision those services more complex. But you also introduce risk into the enterprise. From a cyber perspective, the cyber risks within this portfolio are more significant today than they've ever been, right? So the challenges in terms of your ability to provision the utilities that are necessary for our installations to operate has become more complex. So if you just look at where we were in 1945, then you could argue that in 1945, this nation was at the peak of where we were from an industrial and manufacturing capacity to where we are today. I would argue that from those skill sets, we have lost some of the advantages that we have, and our ability to gain that back is going to be challenging based on where the economic drivers are driving this nation to grow in terms of some of the technology sectors that are growing at pace, and also some of the skills and trades that we have lost over time. But I think what's really important also is the bumper sticker. From an installation and facilities perspective, we have not made significant investments in our facilities and installations, you could argue, in terms of our ability to generate warfighting capacity since 1945. I was talking to some of our folks in Norfolk regarding investments made at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and we have not made significant investments in terms of our ability to increase capacity or make those productions and manufacturing environments more efficient and more effective since after World War II. Of course, we have done projects along the way to make sure that we are able to sustain that environment, but we haven't modernized that facility in quite some time, and that aligns to a lot of the work that NAVFAC has been charged to do and some of the complexity of projects that are on your horizon, which I'll talk about here in a second. But ultimately, I think this paints a picture of where we were at the height of our capacity and where we are today, and highlighting the CNO's comments about that we are in our 1930s moment. So how do we move quickly, especially in the themes of this discussion today, accelerate performance to close the gap in some of these areas that we're seeing right now? Next slide. So I think you can't have a discussion without understanding where we are against our peer adversaries and some of our pacing threats. And so the question I pose frequently, or the highlight that I like to demonstrate, is the fact that today, who has the world's largest Navy? Of course, we are the world's best Navy, without a doubt. And the skills and the capacities and the talents that we bring to bear, we are the world's greatest Navy without peer. But the question of, are we the largest Navy? Next, you could build. And the answer to that question is we are no longer the largest Navy. And in fact, not only are we not the largest Navy in terms of just force structure to force structure, but from our ability to sustain that capacity, to sustain that warfighting advantage, we no longer are the world's largest in terms of our ability to maintain and sustain our force. You can build. So hopefully what you see in front of you today are some statistics regarding our pacing threat, China. In terms of our existing force structure, you'll see there that we're no longer the largest Navy. China has 355 vessels, warfighting platforms in service today, and that number continues to grow at a pace larger than our ability to commission ships. Today, the United States Navy is at 297. Right, so that is a direct comparison, force structure on force structure. But let's look at the metrics associated with our ability to support that force structure. From a shipyard perspective, China currently has greater shipyard production capacity than we have. They have 19 shipyards generating both commercial and warfighting platforms. All of the shipyard infrastructure to produce new platforms across the United States is smaller than a single China shipyard today. So not only do they have more numbers, but the capacity inside those shipyards is greater than what we have today. During World War II, the United States had 50 public and private shipyards that either could build or repair warships greater than 500 feet in length. Today, we have less than 20. And those 20, or less than 20, we have not done significant modernization efforts or looked at doing significant renovations associated with their ability to increase capacity and maintain our platforms more effectively and more efficiently. So our numbers are down, and we haven't made significant investments for quite some time. It's highlighted from our intel community that we anticipate that China's growth is going to be over 400 battle force ships in 2025, growing to and by 2025, almost 425 warfighting platforms. So we're struggling to keep pace. And when you hear CNO talk, she talks about our ability to get more players on the field, our ability to get our units out quickly. And Admiral Cottle's comments this week at SNA, he talked about our warfighting plan, where we are as a nation, and how we're going to compete and win under these circumstances. And what he highlights is that we have 300 ships in our inventory approximately. 100 of those ships are underway at any given time around the globe. And we have 100 ships in deep maintenance, and then 100 ships in some form of readiness in terms of our ability to be able to get those back into the fight. What's really going to determine our ability to win and to win at numbers is our ability to get those 100 ships that are in deep maintenance and those 100 ships that are somewhere inside of our OFRP back into the fight quicker. Our ability to get those platforms re-engaged in conflict. And that is all about accelerating performance. And the NAVFAC portfolio and the investments and the projects that you have been chartered with are really going to have a direct impact on our ability to get those other platforms back out into the fight. And when we are engaged in sustained conflict, our ability to bring those ships back, get them repaired, and get them back underway again. The projects that you have been charged with completing and underneath your oversight are going to determine whether or not those 300 ships can stay engaged in a sustained fight. And accelerating performance around those projects is going to be critical, and why you are critical across all three areas associated with warriors, warfighting, and foundation. And I'll speak to that here in a second. Next slide. So the slide that should be in front of you right now is a facilities requirement slide. And that's a table with a whole bunch of bubbles on that slide. And it's probably hard to see depending on where you are in the room today. But I'm going to talk to this for a second and what this slide represents. Admiral Cottle will tell you that one of the most significant decisions he made inside of Fleet Forces when he took command was when he dual-hatted the NAVFAC Land Commander with the Fleet Forces N46. So today, Admiral Aguayo is not only NAVFAC Land, but she is also inside of the Fleet Forces Headquarters Organization as our N46. Which really brought the ability to have a direct relationship between fleet operations and the NAVFAC Land Commander. One of the tasks that she got when she first took the seat was we were coming out of COVID, and there's a lot of discussions around the significant acquisition portfolio that has direct impact on Fleet Forces and a concern that we have lost touch in some cases with some of our critical projects. The hypothesis was that we were having a challenge in terms of the government's ability to define requirements and provide those requirements to our industrial partners to ensure that there was no gray in between what the government needed and what the contracting our industrial partners wanted to deliver. And then also our ability to understand those requirements in a way that we could estimate the total cost for those requirements and make sure that when industry got that we're aligned in terms of what it was going to take to deliver against those requirements from a cost schedule performance perspective. So Admiral Cottle and Admiral Grady prior to him tasked us to do an economic analysis associated with the significant portfolios that impact our ability to generate forces. One of the areas that we looked at the time underneath Admiral Aguayo's leadership was the NAVFAC portfolio. We looked at NAVFAC projects over the last 5 to 10 years to try to understand across the government and with our partners, did we have a good understanding associated with those requirements? And whether we did or not, was that impacting our ability to ensure that we were staying on cost schedule performance? And so what I want to highlight in this slide, and you don't have to look at the details of it, but there's some thematics associated with it. The individual colors of each bubble represent the year of the project. And I'll highlight that yellow and red indicate the most recent projects that we looked at. And so if you're looking at those bubbles, what you see there as they traverse along the x-axis is that the projects and our most recent projects inside the NAVFAC portfolio are becoming much more complex. And not only are they becoming larger and more complex, the cost to execute those projects is growing, and also the duration of projects is increasing, meaning that Some of our projects are no longer 6, 8, 12 months projects in this portfolio. These projects are critical in terms of our ability to generate forces, and the complexity of those projects we're now looking at multi-year projects in terms of significant requirement and also significant cost. And you're seeing that associated with the yellow bubbles as they move across the x-axis there. But what you really see is that you see a consolidation of bubbles on the left of this slide. What that ultimately represents is that reflects that from a requirements perspective, that the government understood its requirements, and also it reflects that when we provided those requirements to our partners, that our industry partners understood those requirements and they could deliver against it. The y-axis on this slide represents variance, and the variance that we looked at the time was whether or not the cost of these individual projects was exceeding the government estimate. And ultimately, that's a good fiscal indicator of whether or not we're performing on cost. But reality, what we wanted to look at there was whether or not there was good understanding at the requirements base, meaning if the government can define quality requirements, our industrial partners should be able to deliver against those requirements within cost, within schedule, and on time in terms of performance and the things that we're looking at. And since the majority of these bubbles are on the left-hand side, what you're seeing there is very limited variance in terms of an understanding of requirement. So we were delivering on time, within performance, but what you see is a growing in terms of projects, in terms of complexity and duration. There are several bubbles that I'd like to highlight that didn't fit on this slide, that were reflective of yellow dots and red dots. We have projects that are currently underway with a variance in terms of requirement and the variance in terms of cost we could not plot. And those outliers, and there were very few, were some of our most recent projects and also some of our most complex inside of this portfolio. And I'd like to highlight specifically projects around SIOP and shipyard modernization and performance. The understanding of those requirements and the magnitude of those requirements and the variance between what the government put out and what we started to see from our partners, we saw significant variance in those two things to the point where we could no longer plot them. And that's important as we look at the future and where we are from a warfighting perspective and the need to ensure that those projects are on time and on schedule because they have direct impact in terms of our ability to force generate. And I'll talk in terms of how that ties back to warfighting, warriors, and foundation in a moment. But the takeaway from this was an understanding that yes, NAVFAC and its partners understood its work, but ultimately as the projects become more complex, the duration of those projects extend, the cost of those projects increase, that we do have work to do. And this ties back to many of those projects are getting after the shipyard infrastructure that we have not modernized since 1945 that I highlighted in an earlier slide. But ultimately, I want to highlight the fact that I think we have been performing well in this portfolio. Our hypothesis was inaccurate in terms of did we have significant variance between the government and our partners. But ultimately, on a horizon perspective, we need to start to close the gap on that variance because trends do indicate that there's a possibility that we have challenges in front of us in terms of some of those more complex projects. Next slide. So how does this impact the fleet? And ultimately, tying this back to CNO's priorities. When we look at individual projects, sometimes it's hard to understand how those individual projects tie back to impact to operations or impact to the ability for the fleet to force generate to get those forces forward. But at the end of the day, I think what you're seeing is that there is great appreciation and understanding that we now have to treat the shore infrastructure, the NAVFAC portfolio, as a warfighting system and ultimately a weapon system. And we have to prioritize the resources around that. I think the discussions associated with Shore C2 align to that. And ultimately, I think Admiral Cottle's decision to dual hat the NAVFAC Land Commander with our N46 position in Fleet Forces is a reflection of how important and how tied that portfolio is to fleet operations. And that the fleet commanders truly appreciate the risk in this portfolio and how it aligns to our ability to generate forces. The projects associated with unaccompanied housing, right? There have been significant projects in terms of our ability to improve the barracks and the services that we provide our sailors. And any time that we take barrack capacity or rooms offline, where we're impact because we have to take the inventory and the resources that we have within the unencumbered housing portfolio offline, and the demands that we have on our sailors. When we don't have capacity, it puts burdens on our sailors in terms of the number of sailors per room, and ultimately our ability to maintain the trust with our sailors to provision them the services that they should expect. At the end of the day, this has direct correlation to the quality of life and the quality of work of our sailors. And if our sailors have to focus on where they're living, their ability to do training when they're not forward or in the skin of the ship, those are challenges that have direct impact on their quality of life. Ultimately, as we all know, quality of life for sailors will have a direct impact on their ability to focus on work and their ability to deliver against the mission when they are forward. So this does have a direct impact on our ability to generate forces and then sustain forces, and ultimately our ability to recruit and retain the forces that we bring into the Navy. So direct correlation in terms of force generation and force readiness. Some of the projects that we see at Norfolk in terms of the state and the health of our hangars and where we are from a material condition perspective. And as we all know, those projects introduce safety concerns associated with the folks that work within those facilities. But ultimately, it has direct impact on our ability to generate forces and also our ability to maintain our forces in an efficient environment, in a work environment that enables high-end maintenance and also the ability to maintain our forces in a highly effective and efficient way. Same thing associated with our piers. The material condition of our piers, especially some of our piers in Norfolk and around CONUS actually, is also having direct impact on our ability to maintain our forces in terms of some of the utilities and services and hoteling services that we provide to our ships. The lack of stable power, the impact associated with water, sewage, power outage, all those types of things have an impact on our ability to conduct maintenance on those ships when they're tied to the pier, and our ability as those ships enter long maintenance periods, the impact that has on the 100 platforms that Admiral Cottle highlighted in terms of what we needed to do to get those units back out into the fight. Our material condition, both in our hangars and our piers, have direct impact, not necessarily on the units that are currently deployed, but the ability for the fleet and our TICOMs to get their units back out into the fight. And then we also know that interruptions in terms of HVAC power have direct impact on our ability to provide those services as well. But also from a utilities perspective, understanding that portfolio in terms of cyber risk, some of the complexity associated with now the Internet of Things and how we've IP-enabled a number of our utilities introduces complexity, and then also highlights the fact that it's not just basic utilities that are being provisioned, it's critical utilities that ultimately also introduce critical risk areas that we didn't have to think about in the future. Tying back to the shipyards and some of the forecasting future for the NAVFAC portfolio, our ability to get our players back in the field, our ability to get those 100 units forward, and ultimately our ability to meet cost schedule performance in our maintenance portfolio is critical. Right, so I'd like to tie this slide back to the question or the comment that General Mattis provided at ICAF when he was asked the question in terms of, why is the United States Marine Corps the most lethal fighting force the world has ever known? As he built on that answer, what he highlighted was that every time a Marine goes forward, what they don't have to worry about are the things back home. They don't have to worry about are their families being taken care of. They don't have to worry about their spouses or their dependents. They know that the Marine Corps enterprise is doing everything it can to ensure that the quality of life and the quality of service, not only for the individual Marine, but their families, their dependents, is also being taken care of by the Marine Corps back home and all the Marines and previous Marines. And so they didn't have to worry about the community that was supporting them. So they could focus on the fight. They didn't have to worry about quality of life, quality of service. And they also knew that the Marine Corps enterprise was doing everything possible to ensure that the capabilities that they need to fight and win were going to be delivered to them. Right. So if you look at the NAVFAC portfolio and how some of these areas and focus areas that we have work to do on, they directly contribute to quality of life and quality of service for our sailors that are forward, and the ability to ensure and to provide confidence in them that we're taking care of their families, we're focused on quality of life for their dependents, and also that when they come back home, that we're able to maintain our platforms and get them back out in the fight in a high material condition. So NAVFAC's portfolio and the importance of these projects have direct correlation in terms of our ability to support the warrior. It has direct correlability in terms of engaging in the warfight and getting our units forward to ensure that we're successful in warfighting. And then at the end of the day, the NAVFAC portfolio will set the time and tempo of our ability within the foundation to ensure that the foundational things that our sailors need are provided for them. So NAVFAC and the work here has direct correlation, not just in the foundation, which is where I think people would imply you fit, but in reality, you have direct impact on the warrior, you have direct impact on warfighting, and you have direct impact and will set the tempo for the foundation. And that is where I know Admiral Cottle sees NAVFAC fitting in CNO's vision and why it was so important in terms of our alignment of Shore C2 and also the small things that we're doing inside of Fleet Forces with the realignment of Admiral Aguayo into our headquarters staff. Next slide. So where can we go and what things should we focus on in terms of the partnership between the government and industry? And I'd like to highlight a couple of things on this slide. I won't go through it in detail, but we really need to take a look at public-private partnership. Have we identified areas where we can partner better? Have we looked at innovative ways from an acquisition perspective, from a contract perspective, on how we partner to deliver services? Are there unique, innovative ways to where we look at doing things differently, especially some of those large projects that I highlighted that we're unable to plot on the variant slide? Those large projects that are going to be critical to force generation, are there unique ways in terms of public-private partnership that we can get after those things to ensure that we're able to provide those services to increase capacity in some of those areas and also stay focused on accelerating performance in those areas? We also need to look at areas to remove barriers of entry. Are there folks or partners that we have not engaged with historically that we can bring to the fight, that we can make sure that the technical expertise in some of the areas that I highlighted earlier in terms of manufacturing expertise in the United States, innovative expertise in some of these areas that we're in a war on talent for? Is there a way to bring some of that additional capacity and some of those talents into the fight and remove the barrier for those folks to engage with the government to bring their skills to these portfolios going forward? But how do we expand our ability and partnership with other folks in this space? There is no kidding a war on talent in this space, as highlighted by the 3% metric associated with manufacturing talent in this nation today. There's a war on talent for these trades. And so how do we identify opportunities to partner as we address that workforce? And we'll also look at ways to remove barriers to bring talent into the government to support us in this portfolio. We have to look at that. We also have to make sure that the Navy, our shipyards, and these areas that NAVFAC focus on, that we're viewed not only inside the Navy, but also our partners as an employer of choice, that people are committed and want to be part of this portfolio and the work that we have here. As people evolve towards the technology sector, as the metrics highlight, the ability to have direct impact on this nation, on warriors, on warfighting, and the foundation. How do we attract talent to want to come work in this portfolio and make us the employer of choice and work together in partnership as opposed in terms of conflict as we look at the war on talent to try to bring some of that expertise into our space? Next slide. From a fleet perspective, where are we and what are we doing here? So I want to highlight back to CNO's comment that we are in a 1930s environment. One of the things that we're doing right now, Fleet Forces under Admiral Cottle's leadership has kicked off the development of a global maritime response plan. Our assessment is that today we're able to force generate our forces to be able to meet our deployed requirements, as you see happening around the globe today, right now in real world. But if we enter sustained conflict with one of our peer adversaries, specifically as I highlight China's capacity earlier, are we able to sustain conflict for a long period of time? What will ultimately be a maritime conflict in this decisive decade. Can we sustain that? The question is, I'm not sure, or the answer to that question is, I'm not sure. So we're looking at the relationships, we're looking at the partnerships, we're looking at our ability to not only put forces forward, but when those units come back for replenishment, for when those units come back because they've taken on battle damage, our ability to repair those units and get them back into the fight. Do we have the capacity inside of our facilities, inside of our installations, inside of some of these critical areas to be able to get those units back out into the fight in a timely way? How do we accelerate performance there? Not only in the initial salvo of getting units forward, but the ability to sustain conflict in a World War I, World War II mentality. Do we have that capacity? And the Global Maritime Response Plan is working across our TICOMs to include CNIC, NAVFAC, and other folks to make sure that we're looking at this problem holistically. The shores and infrastructure as a platform. I think the item I'd like to highlight there is the relationship with NAVFAC and Aguayo here at Fleet Forces Command, and also with the Southeast region, and also the evolution associated with Shore C2 and the alignment of the region commanders up through the fleet commanders in an OPCON role, where now we have region commanders reporting to the fleet commanders from an operational perspective on where we are from a readiness perspective, which highlights the fact that this portfolio needs to be viewed differently and also is recognized as a critical warfighting capability in terms of our ability to fight and win in the future. We also have fleet sprints that we're doing right now to look at some of the facility challenges that we have at our installations to try to figure out how do we bring fleet capacity, fleet resources, fleet partnership to get after some of the challenges that we have right now, whether that is four-star advocacy associated with the new Shore C2 alignment, or also fleet resources. If we can identify those projects that have direct impact on our ability to generate forces to meet the FG demand, can the fleet bring advocacy, but also resources to the fight to make sure that we're solving our most critical projects that have direct impact on the fleet, our sailors, and the quality of life that we provide them, ultimately aligning back to the CNO's vision. So again, I ask, where does NAVFAC fit in the CNO's vision? And from a fleet perspective, you fit in all three. The foundation is not your pillar. Your pillar is warfighting, the ability to deliver these projects on time, and most importantly, the more complex that your projects that you're working on today are critical in terms of our ability to generate forces and to fight and win in the future. You are in the warfighting pillar. And in fact, the projects you're working on will be critical in terms of the fleet's ability to fight and win in warfighting. You are also the quality of service lead for this Navy, and the ability to deliver on the quality of service needs for our sailors and their families. You are driving that. And what we all know is that family readiness, sailor readiness, quality of service for our sailors has a direct impact on their ability to fight and win so they can stay focused on mission. Back to General Mattis's comment, our ability to ensure that we're delivering on quality of service initiatives will ensure that the sailor can focus on the fight, and while they're engaged in the fight, they don't have to worry about what's happening back home. So you are directly tied to warriors. So warfighting and our warriors. And then ultimately, in the foundation area, you will set the time and tempo for that. We know that our ability to deliver maintenance on time will be dependent on a number of projects that you currently have in your portfolio. Your ability to accelerate performance on those projects, deliver those projects on time, within cost, within schedule, will have a direct impact on warriors and warfighting, and you will set the tempo for our ability for the foundation to support those things. So from a fleet perspective, we see you on all three. We see you in all of them. And I believe the relationships from a C2 perspective also reflect that. The alignment between the fleet and NAVFAC has never been stronger. And the partnership required with our industrial partners, the Navy, NAVFAC, and the fleet are more important than ever, associated with the challenge that the CNO presented to us in terms of we're in our 1930s moment. So how do we scale to ensure that we're able to generate the forces necessary to fight and win in the future? And NAVFAC is in the center of that. So with that, I'd like to stop there and open up for any questions or comments. And would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Would like to thank you for the opportunity to bring a fleet perspective into this discussion, and also highlight the importance of where we see the partnership and NAVFAC playing in our ability to fight and win, and also recognize the sailors who are actually engaged in kinetic operations today and the importance of our ability to support them into the future. With that, thanks for the time and look forward to any questions or comments.